look, this is not a dilemma
Thanks, Ross.
common to just the Australian government. This is being felt right around the world right now, largely as a result of sanctions on Russia.
Well, certainly, just on Australia's situation, you mentioned the budget there and the huge increase in public debt. I mean, it's true that all countries have increased their public debt a great deal because of COVID and the various supports put in place. But it is worth pointing out that Australia's public debt increased basically more than any other nation on earth except the US. It's really a standout there in terms of the increase in debt. So sure, the unemployment rates come down. That's a good thing. And you mentioned there that there's a lot of revenue flowing into the coffers at the moment. That's also a good thing. But, it's worth pointing in mind that, those good unemployment figures have come at a great long-term cost for the government.
And we should also make note that in the US, where there's been 6 interest rate rises now flagged of 0.25% each, some of them are going to be 0.5%, there's no doubt, that Australia tends to follow the United States on these things. If Australia is behind the curve, you and I have talked about that before, then clearly the interest bill on that debt rises in time.
Yeah, look, that's right. I mean, it's a huge debt. It's about $1 trillion, I think, if you add up the states and the federal government. And both levels of government will be affected by those interest rate increases. I mean, it's basically inevitable that Australia's rates are going to follow the US rates and the European rates, which have all been increasing. I think the other risk for Australia too is we're still extremely vulnerable to commodity prices in terms of our currency and our overall economic confidence. And, that iron ore price is still very high, which is great. Kind of right now, but you do wonder what Australia is going to do in the medium to long term to maintain its high terms of trade.
Okay, so let's go back to sanctions, shall we, on Russia. Now, the one thing about sanctions is you would hope that while they might cause some harm to your community, they would cause more harm to the community that they're directed at. And I think that's probably true. But the issue here is, given the European situation where there's a lack of energy, a lack of gas, and really even other parts of the world where inflation is taking off, at some point you've got to take stock in regards to who really is being hurt by the sanctions.
Yeah, look, I think it's a good point, and I think there's no doubt that Russia has been hurt far more than the allies who are imposing the sanctions. Although that said, it's worth pointing out they did introduce that nifty little trick this week when they insisted that they be paid in rubles instead of euros for their massive energy exports to Europe. And of course, the ruble bounced back very significantly, kind of against the US dollar. So I thought that was an interesting fight back of Russia. But look, I mean, the broader point is that, it's certainly hurt their economy greatly, whether you look at inflation or the stock market or the level of unemployment. But you have to say, historically, sanctions do not work to remove the government. And that's the target, obviously, the Putin government, Vladimir Putin. There's really no evidence in modern history, whether you look at Iran or Venezuela or North Korea or Zimbabwe, where sanctions, even if they're in place for a very long time, make any difference at all in changing the government. So my view would be we need to come up with some off-ramps at the moment, the West does, to reduce these sanctions, not just for ordinary Russian people, but for people in the West too. I mean, we're going to face a food crisis soon. I mean, Joe Biden said so much this week. He said there's going to be a food shortage. The oil market responds very quickly. The food market's a lot slower, and the agricultural exports from Russia and Ukraine are huge. And we haven't seen the full impact of basically chopping those off quite yet. And it could be really ugly.
Okay, so that's odd because, as we talked about the Australian budget earlier, you think about coal prices, oil and gas prices, wheat prices, nickel prices. All of these things play completely into Australia's bailiwick, and especially with the Australian dollar being so low.
No, look, that's a good point, and I was talking globally then. I wasn't speaking as an Australian. I agree. Some aspects of these sanctions are actually helpful for Australia. I would agree, but look, the longer term interest of Australia is the health of the world economy, and there might be a short term fill-up for Australia in some of these commodity prices, but I think longer term, I don't think it's in Australia's interest to see the world basically shifting into two vast trading blocks. And that's what could happen. I mean, with Russia and China, I think I read just extremely recently that Russia and Iran are coming up with some new system to get around the SWIFT payment system. I mean, that's all to be expected. And of course, if China joins in, a few other countries join in, suddenly you have two systems when you only had one before, and that's a bad thing for everyone. So, bottom line is, I think these sanctions that make everyone feel good and they're tough, but I don't think they really make much difference to the ultimate aim, and that is to get rid of the Putin government.
Okay, just very quickly to finish up, I know you've been looking at electric vehicles across the US in the past week, and oil prices being so high, gas prices in the States being so high. Is this the catalyst to actually have the world really take on electric vehicles to reduce the prices, to make them more viable for the communities?
Well, look, I think it might be. I spent some time in Detroit in Michigan, which of course is the headquarters of Ford and General Motors, and I was just shocked at how serious both those companies are taking electric vehicles. And it was a big contrast to me to the attitude back in Australia, where I think EVs are still seen as a niche product or an inferior product in some cases. But I was certainly convinced by Ford and General Motors that A, they're taking it very seriously, and B, that they are better products. I mean, they're spending billions on these cars, new factories, kind of right around the US. Ford in particular, just in a few weeks, is going to launch an electric version of the #1 selling car in the US, the F-150 truck. So that's a very big change, to be electrifying your biggest selling product. And I think it's a reminder of how serious they're taking it in the US at the transition, whereas in Australia, not so much.
I'll tell you what, Adam, always good to have in the program. We'll talk in a couple of weeks' time. Many thanks for your time today.